I've been doing product for a very long time, about 40 years. I started as an engineer for 10 years. And then I wanted to learn product management. I wanted to learn product design. So, yeah, and I also wanted to learn product leadership, which includes engineering management, design management, and management of product management. So I had a long career working at tech companies in Silicon Valley. And then my last real company I worked at was eBay. And after that, I just wanted to work mostly with startups and growth stage companies. And then several of them grew into very large companies. And I started writing. I wrote the first book I wrote was Inspired. And that introduced me to companies far outside Silicon Valley. That was the best reason, really, to write the book, was to sort of discover these places all over the planet. Mostly CEOs and heads of product would reach out to me and sometimes invite me to their companies, and I would spend some time with them and try to help them learn those same techniques. So for a long time, it was really all spreading those techniques. And the reason for the most recent book was because there have been always, since the very beginning, really with Inspired, there have always been companies that have told me they love the techniques, but they don't believe that those techniques could apply in their old style company with their old style management. And of course, we knew that that wasn't true because we had been working with companies for 20 years to do those changes. But it's also understandable why people, if they've never seen it before, why they would be skeptical. So we decided, write one more book that instead of sharing techniques like we did in Inspired and Empowered, we would share the stories of companies that have actually changed and what it means for them to change and what they could do after they changed. And we in particular said we're not going to use any of the Silicon Valley companies that were born in this model. These are only going to be companies that had to change to this way of working. And so that was the reason for the new book. And that's been out for a few months now. And I'm already hearing from companies that have taken the book and started these changes themselves, which is, of course, that was the real goal. So anyway, that's sort of my background.
What are the key differences you see between Europe and the US? And wondering also how does it influence the product management practice according to you?
Yeah. It's funny. I literally just got back a couple days ago from a trip to Australia, and they, of course, everywhere in the world ask the exact same question
Right.
because everybody thinks that they're different. And of course, everybody is different, but really not in the ways I think people think. And it was funny because I was in this company in Australia, in Sydney, a terrific company. You may know them. They're called Canva. They're, of course, very successful company today.
Mhm.
But I had been spending some time with their leadership team earlier that day, and I was realizing that if it wasn't just for the accents in the language, it could have been easily any tech company in San Francisco. It could have been a great tech company in London. It could have been anywhere. And the truth is, everywhere in the world I go, including, just to be very clear, San Francisco, there are great companies and there are companies that are so far away from that, it's hard to believe. It is true in Sydney. It is true in Amsterdam. It is true in San Francisco. It's true in New York. And so it's not that you go to another country and they're like way behind. You go to another country and you find some companies that are very progressive and many companies that are not. That's my experience all around the world. We tried to highlight that in the book Transformed. I mean, I featured teams from Saudi Arabia. I mean, that is not known as a tech hub, but there's an amazing team there. One of the best teams in the world I know is based in London. And we highlighted them in the book as well. They're called Trainline. There are some cultural differences that sometimes make things either easier or harder. But to be honest, that's not as common as you think. In places like Japan, for example, Culturally, disagreement is a lot less comfortable for people. But as you probably know, in the product world, in order to come up with great products, this sort of healthy friction is necessary ingredient to the recipe. And some cultures make that harder to do. It's not impossible. It does take more time because you have to really get this out on the table and talk with the teams about why this kind of friction is necessary. But uh, that's I rarely run into that in Europe, for example. One cultural thing that I do run into occasionally in Europe is this sort of addiction to process, and that does come up a lot. That is not just in Europe. It is, in fact, it's in a large portion of the U.S. as well, especially in the military East Coast side of the U.S., where a lot of the government projects are. So there are things like that that impact the differences. But like I said, the higher order point is there are great companies and there are not very good companies everywhere I go.
How do you learn product management in 2024? How do you deal with the risk of joining a company that may have very bad product management practices?
Well, first of all, there's not just one kind of product management out there. There's multiple kinds or schools, I'll call it, of product management, different ways of thinking. The product management that's used in companies following the product model is very different than the product management that's used in companies that are following the older models. So the first thing you need to do is decide which model do you want to work in, or which model does your company work in. It's not very hard to figure out which it is, but you might not like which it is. One of the things we tell people, if you're trying to learn product, the most important thing is not actually the company you join. If you join a great company, you're much more likely to learn what you need to learn. However, the biggest issue, even at a great company, the biggest issue is who your manager is, because your manager is the person who is responsible for coaching and developing you into a skilled product manager. And that makes all the difference in the world. Most of the best product people I know, that's how they learned. They could have been anywhere, but they learned it from a manager that knew how to do product well and was committed to helping and coaching them. There are many books, there are many courses, many workshops, many things you can do, but the most important thing is to be aware, because those books, some of them teach the product model, most of them don't. In truth, most of them don't. And I don't blame anybody for teaching the old models, because that's where the market is, right? That's what most people are doing. So why shouldn't they cater to that? That's up to them. But of course, my interest has always been in the best product teams in the world. Whatever they use is what I'm interested in. We try to point this out all the time, but nothing in any of the books was invented by us. Nothing. It's all we're doing is sharing what we see being used in the companies that have proven they can consistently do product well. So if they start doing something differently, then we are all over it, and we try to see how it works and decide and suggest it to other companies. And if it works well there, we just start sharing it. So where do you learn how to do product well? The most important thing is to find a manager that has experience working in a good company and that is willing to coach you. And fortunately, if you do some LinkedIn work, you can usually find that out.
A company per se might not have really great product management practices, but if you have the right coach within that organization, you can go and progress, right?
That's right.
Then you mentioned that, okay, you may join a company that is not necessarily applying the product operating model as we would advocate for it. But then you would join for a great product manager that can coach you. But you
Yeah.
ultimately are in an environment that is prone to blocking you or preventing you to actually progress toward your ultimate goals or your ambition to actually applying that product operating model. So how do you solve that conflict?
working in a company that has no idea about what we're talking about and no real interest, you can still raise your skills. You can still start demonstrating to your team, to your manager, to the stakeholders that you now know a lot more than you did before. And you are now potentially much more useful to them. And that is often the start of that journey. Now, can you get the CEO to change everything? No, they probably don't even know who you are. But you can start progressively earning trust in the organization and getting increasing responsibility. That's exactly what, of course, we want to do. And this is called sense of agency. And this is one of those things that does vary by culture around the world, but it is really important for any product person, in my opinion, to develop a strong sense of agency, which is to realize that they can do much more than they probably thought they could do. They can't do everything, but they can do more. And if you're willing to put in the work and start earning that progressive trust, that's when things get better.
What would be your best advice to any product manager to gain that trust in order to reach a point where they can eventually influence the way product management is done within that organization?
In most companies, there's always, some people are much more willing to grant trust. Some stakeholders will trust you by default until you prove otherwise, but most of them are not like that. And by the way, I understand why they're not like that. Remember, the stakeholders in a company are there to protect the assets of the company. One of the worst possible things you could have are product managers that don't know how to do their job, that are then expecting and demanding sometimes trust from the stakeholders, and the stakeholders look at them and say they have no idea. This is the biggest single reason that I think product owners has been the worst thing to happen to the product industry. That doesn't mean Agile is the worst, because Agile's not the issue. The issue is the role of a product owner. That's a ridiculous role. It is a delivery role. This is the irony in the product model. Delivery is not even the responsibility of the product manager. Discovery is the responsibility of the product manager, the primary responsibility. So a product owner role makes absolutely no sense. The training somebody gets to be a product owner is ridiculous, because it's nothing to do with product management. It's just delivery management. So the result is that we have more people in the world than ever that have some product-related title, usually product owner, and the stakeholders go to the CEO and says, these people are useless to us. There is no way we are going to trust them. And they're not wrong. That's the problem. They're not wrong. So the point is, you need to make sure you have earned that trust. And as a product manager, you earn that trust by demonstrating that you've learned deeply about your users, about your data, most importantly, about how your business works, the sales dynamics, the marketing constraints, the financial constraints, the monetization strategy, the compliance requirements, legal implications and requirements. All of these, if the product manager does not know these things, I promise you the stakeholders will not trust them, and the whole thing falls apart.
How it can look like applying the product operating model startups and large organizations.
I would argue the principles in the product model apply to every size company. And by the way, that's the case because what defines a successful large-scale product model company is that they are consistently innovating. If you look at Amazon, for example, it is probably one of the best examples of product model companies in the world. They have efforts at every level. They have hundreds of startups within Amazon. They have dozens of scale-ups within Amazon. And they have several, at this point, the company like AWS is bigger than the original e-commerce company was. And that started through that process.
Can you give us alternative or other example than Amazon
It's easy to answer your question. In fact, not far from you, Spotify is a beautiful example of the product model. I think that a lot of people got confused because they heard this thing called the Spotify model that was a ridiculous summary of not the important things they do. And it's just so they got confused. They thought the Spotify model was tribes and guilds and squads, which are just their words for what we do. That's not relevant. What matters is how they decide what to work on, how they do product discovery, how they do product delivery. That's what matters. And I shared an article recently called The Product Model at Spotify that was written along with one of the original product coaches at Spotify. Anyway, to answer your question, Stripe is an amazing example, large company doing I would argue, the product model as well as anybody in the world. Netflix is a terrific example. They have demonstrated these skills over and over. Apple is a fantastic example, and they're a hardware company, not only hardware, of course, but fundamentally at its basis, they do a small number of amazing devices. They also have services like Siri. They also have operating systems, which are their own kind of animal, but they're a great example of it as well. Google's kind of tricky because they're so big and so diverse, but much of Google is a good example of the product model. So, you know, we could keep going. These are big companies, obviously, but that's fine. It's good for people to see that this scales to very, very large companies.
In those large scales organization, how does empowerment?
That is, I think the leaders of those companies would tell you the reason they empower their teams is precisely to scale. But you're asking, how does it scale? I mean, the short answer is I would read the book Empowered. That's exactly why it was written, was to show how those companies scale. Because a lot of people seem to believe, again, these are people that are taking a very different view of the world, a process view. People say, oh, well, when you need to scale agile, you need to adopt these formal processes like SAFe or less, which is just nonsense because the biggest companies in the world don't use that. And they innovate and scale much better than this. So yeah, that's just ridiculous. But so how do you scale? You scale with primarily by what we started with talking about, by coaching. That is the primary tool of scale. That's the primary tool of empowerment. And the idea is you set up these cross-functional teams, you give them problems to solve, and you give them the strategic context to understand how to make good decisions, and then they get to work. And it's important to point out, and especially because this is sometimes a confusion in Europe, empowered teams does not mean less management, it means better management. So the role of leadership, the role of management is even more important in a empowered organization.
Inspired has been first published 16 years ago. Obviously, you have republished an updated version.
Yeah, just to be clear, the second edition of Inspired was 100% new. I didn't keep a single page from the first edition. So that was 2018. A surprise. Well, first of all, I would say nothing in there is not true anymore. However, there has been some big changes. The biggest one by far was of course caused by the pandemic, which was at the time we wrote Inspired, both editions, co-located teams were the norm, and remote working was occasionally done. It wasn't working that well, but it was occasionally done. During the pandemic, of course, that reversed. And now, like for every company I advise, they're at least majority remote, if not fully remote. So that is a big difference. Now, the problem is it's not as good. That's the problem. And everybody I've talked to has said the same thing. Everybody who is trying to make remote work, don't get me wrong, it can work. And I've been spending my time trying to do that. But wow, things that used to happen in a day can take a week. And it's not the delivery that's hard, it's the discovery that's harder. And that is where there are a number of challenges. And I have been considering writing one last book, which would be a third edition of Inspired. And the main reason to write that is because I want to talk about how to do good product discovery when you have distributed teams. The reason I haven't started on that is because I don't think we have a good answer yet to that question. We have a bunch of bad answers to that question. So I could tell you what the best I see done, but it's not very good. And I think we need to either wait for better tools and better technologies to help us with that problem, especially the true collaboration problem, or we need other approaches and techniques that work differently around that.
What triggers your post, and how do you decide what you will write on?
The majority of my articles come from questions that I get from people, either when I give talks like this or very often, pretty much every morning, I wake up to emails from people around the world with questions. And in truth, 90% of them are questions I've answered in articles. So I just send them a link to the article, and that's very easy. But sometimes it's a different question. And when I see a different question, and especially when I see that different question from different people in different companies, then I start to realize this is something that's important for probably many people. And that's what I will start working on, those topics. And I love those. That's why I'm genuinely grateful when people do email me questions. This is the inspiration for a lot. And I don't know how many people have told me they don't understand how I know that they are struggling with an issue right now, and I publish an article and it's just what they're dealing with. And it's not because of any big mystery. It's because if they're struggling with it, other people are probably struggling with it.
Many companies are now in a life or death situation, and product managers are worried because they see many bad practices coming back due to stress and panic. What would you advise to safeguard those good product management practices, and how do you handle those crisis moments?
I have seen maybe 10 major ups and downs over the years. And we are definitely in a down for sure. And there are a lot of uncertainties. And as you probably know, businesses hate uncertainty, but they're not certain about the impact of things like generative AI. They're not certain about, I'll be honest, they're not certain about Agile. Because they were promised all these benefits from Agile, and they look at what's happened to Agile and they're like, yeah, that has not delivered on the promise, especially those companies that got taken over by process people and they moved really to the opposite of Agile and they called it Agile. So they're frustrated and confused about that. Also, the cost of funds, which is as fundamental as you get, that has gone up. So that has caused uncertainty and confusion. So there's a lot of stress on companies. And when they have that stress, the first thing they do is they don't want to hire. And we're seeing that. Second thing they do is they often look for people that they think are, well, if we lost these people, would we still be okay? That's the question they're always asking. And I mean, I think this is where the product industry, the product people need to look hard and say, like, we have a lot of different roles out there. Does it make sense? Are those roles cost justified? And some of them, I would argue, absolutely yes. They are what makes our investment in engineers worthwhile. And other roles are really struggling to show their value. And so I have for a long time now, but especially over the last 2 years, I have been encouraging anybody that's a product owner to get to worry about this and to raise their skills. Even if they stay called a product owner, they should raise their skills to be a true product manager.
We receive loads of feedback saying that if someone has to start reading your book, they should start by Transform first. Can you explain a bit why this would be the first entry point? And
I mean, it's not, first of all, I also said you could really read them in any order and it's fine. But when people ask me what is the best, because I've heard now from many people where Transform was their first book. And after that, they read the others. And those people, I think the reason they're in better shape is because Transform lays out the principles, just gets the principles of the product model. And in a I mean, that's the idea, is it tries to lay it out so that anybody in a company could understand, from an individual contributor engineer up to the CEO. That's what was hard about writing that new book, because the other books are all written for product people. But Transform was written for anybody. And a lot of people have told me now they read Transform, they understand the fundamentals. They understand why we need to do experiments. They understand why innovation is a trade-off with predictability. These are really critical principles, and they understand that first. And then, based on their role, if they're a product manager, they would typically read Inspired. If they're a product leader, they would typically then read Empowered. If they're an engineer, they'd probably read Inspired. So that's where the order might be different. If they're product marketing, they would read, hopefully, Loved, which is the book in the series written by my marketing partner, Martina.
we'll go for now for the question in the audience. Yeah, that's the first one.
Hi. What is the first thing you do after you convince the leadership of let's say, a very old school feature focused company of the product model?
So the question was,
what's the first thing you do after you convince them and they say, yes, let's go with this?
Yeah, the first thing we recommend is an assessment, an organizational assessment. And by the way, we included our assessment, our actual assessment that my partners and I do when we work with a company. We just included the whole thing in the book Transformed. So you can go to that chapter. I forget the chapter number, what it is, maybe 29, I forget. But and you can use the same assessment we do. We encourage that. Or you can make your own assessment up. But that's the one we ask. Once you do that assessment, you have a much better understanding of the work ahead of you.
So I worked in consultancy. Now I work for a big corporate in Belgium. It's a telecom company. I'm currently in the top 40, so I've seen the different layers. I'd be curious to hear a bit how you talk with departments that are less friendly to this topic. And specifically, what I've seen is HR departments and finance can typically play an indirect role in all of this. Do you ever spend time convincing those department leads to also adjust, or is that a bit of a blank spot?
No, absolutely. In fact, this is the reason. And by the way, you mentioned that I think you're working at a telco now. You may have figured this out already, but telcos are among the most difficult kinds of companies in the world to get to change. And that's because they basically make so much money that they don't want to change anything. And so it can be very difficult to persuade a telco. That's something we've all learned the hard way. But yes, in it, say HR or finance or sales, they can all prevent a transformation if they're not addressed and supported. I would encourage you to take a look at the new book. I know I sound like I'm selling books, but I'm not trying to. But if you look at the new book, Transform, there are the biggest section in the back is it's right at the end, is for each of these departments, including HR, including finance, there is a chapter listing their common objections and how we respond to those objections. The bottom line is they're legitimate objections. Unless you have good answers to those, they probably are not going to go along with this change. So how you handle those objections is critically important.
How long in average does it take to transform? more particularly in sales-led SaaS companies? And are there any specific risk ratio area to address in such case?
Well, the how long it takes, and I'm very open about this. First of all, we don't even consider a startup transformation. It's so much easier in a startup. You can literally spend 2 weeks with a startup and completely change how they work. It is not, if you can fit them all in a room, it is not hard to get them to change. However, in a medium or large company, it's typically 1 to 3 years. So 1 to 3 years, not weeks, years. And the reason for that doesn't mean that you wait 3 years before you see any results. It means the best way to transform is product team by product team. And so you start with a small number, 1, 2, maybe 3. You show it works there, and you progressively earn that trust to the organization. That's what ends up taking a year for a business unit. And then you might have multiple business units in a large company. So it's not hard to see how it grows into years. And that's if the company is doing well and they're serious about this. Now, you also asked about sales-driven SaaS companies. Sales-driven companies in general are very challenging. That's why one of the best transformation stories I've ever seen is by a 100% sales-driven company in the financial services area, which is called DataSite, which we documented their case study in the book Transformed. To your question, how long it takes, same. So sales-driven, same, 1 to 3 years for that. And it is especially hard when it's sales-driven because it's a very cultural thing. And I will say the most important thing to realize in order to change from sales-driven to product is building trust with sales. Building trust with sales. And I don't want to, and there's too much to summarize in just a minute here, but in that case study in the book, you will see what the head of product did to earn the trust of the head of sales. And that's the kind of work that has to happen to succeed.
What do you think caused some companies, even small ones, to focus so much on process? And have you seen some example of what companies did to change it?
Well, I think the appeal of process is understandable. People think that, oh, if we could just have a recipe, then we'll be able to, replicate this. And I understand why they think that, but it's just not true. And good companies learn that very quickly. And they are, it's interesting. The only thing I have ever seen that truly scared the leaders of, literally leaders of Google, leaders of Apple, leaders of Netflix, leaders of Amazon, the only thing they all seem to say the same thing is they're scared of process taking over their company. If you want to know why, there is an amazing video recorded a long time ago by Steve Jobs, and he described what he called the disease of process people taking over companies. And yes, I understand the appeal. It doesn't work. And so they have to understand the alternative to that. Unfortunately, process is sort of like religion. It's not like, oh, do you use this technique? No, we'll switch to this technique. That's easy. Process for some people is religious. And those are the people where some cases, and I know what I'm about to say is kind of rough, but in some cases, those people, unless and until they're removed from the company has no hope of transforming.
You already touched a bit upon it earlier during the interview, but a thing you see in feature team models is that often there's a very high ratio of product roles versus engineers, while a trend I see now is that product management is becoming more and more of a distributed role. So engineers taking up things that product managers did in the past. And also great product companies like a Linear, for instance, or even a Snapchat, they have very few product managers. So my question for you is, do you think that in the future there will still be a big demand for product managers?
Honestly, I think you're misinterpreting a lot of what's going on there. That's not what I think is actually going on. What you're seeing is different models of product management in different companies. And so it is true that, and I've always been surprised about this, but if you are in the product model, you don't need a lot of product managers. You need very good product managers, but you don't need a lot. And you definitely don't need a lot of these sort of supporting roles. A lot of companies, because they think the product management job is too hard, they end up adding other roles. They split product manager and product owner, which is a terrible mistake. It's a serious anti-pattern, but they split that because they think that it's too much for one. What they end up doing is destroying their chances for innovation and making it so the engineers are like, well, who do we listen to? This is ridiculous. Two cooks in the kitchen. So that's a problem. And they also split it other ways. They'll say, oh, well, you need a product ops person in order to help you do this. No, you don't. In a good product company, they might have people in product ops that are there to support them, but they are doing this role. So I do think now the biggest issue that gets in the way of a product manager doing their role is when they are also trying to be project manager. So that's what we don't want the product manager to do. We want them to let go of the project management. In feature team companies, there is, in my opinion, and I know it's not popular, a tremendous amount of waste. And so a lot of CEOs have seen that waste, and that's what we talked about a few minutes ago. They see that waste and they're like, we don't really need all these people, and it's not really doing that much. So, okay. But I would argue that it's not a change. We have always had good companies that had a much smaller percentage of people doing the product role, and we've always had not very good companies throwing lots of people at the problem instead of solving it at its core.
I have a question about the approach of bottom-up transformation. It's easier when you persuade top management, not that easy middle management, to change organization in the big enterprises. But have you ever seen in your practice changes that has been triggered bottom-up? And there is a second part of the question: if this change is not succeeding, do you advise the product people to run from that organization?
Well, this is a very nuanced question because it's not binary. It's not black and white, bottom up, top down, top down, bottom. It's not like that. The way it works, and to answer your question directly, yes, I have seen bottom up triggered transformations. The biggest one I ever saw was actually in London at the BBC, which was a bottom-up triggered transformation very early on, and they accomplished some amazing things. In their culture, it kind of has to be triggered bottom-up because they're very senior leaders or government appointees. They're not actually what we would consider the leaders. So, but I have definitely seen that. It's not unusual at all for bottom-up to trigger. And let's play that out. Here's how it often plays out. I'm going to come back, though, to the second part of your question, which is really important. But here's how it plays out. A person on a product team, often the product manager, will say, well, maybe they're a product owner and they believe they can and should do better. And they convince their own product team that, yeah, well, why don't we try doing some of these things? And they can do a lot without anybody's permission because there's all these things. There are some things that do require permission, but there's a lot of things they can do that don't. Starting with learning about their customers, starting with learning about how their business works, learning about the data. What happens when they do that is their capabilities expand. The stakeholders almost immediately start noticing that their product manager is now much more of a partner than before. They actually seem to understand and appreciate what their constraints are. And it's a lot easier for them to say, I'm starting to really trust this person and feel like I have a partner in the technology group and not just somebody I have to oversee and tell what to do. And then what happens? Well, then they start saying, all right, instead of just building this feature, maybe together we can figure out the best way to solve this problem. Because now we've sort of earned that right. We've demonstrated that we have that ability and they're willing to give that a chance. Now, if that works, the stakeholders start talking, the teams start talking, the managers start noticing, and you see this progressively grow. It doesn't grow from one team to the whole company immediately, but it can grow from one team to multiple teams to a business unit. And at that point, I promise you, the CEO is at least noticing this business unit is working differently. If that business unit outperforms the other business units, then that's when the CEO will usually say, all right, it seems like something useful is going on here. Why don't we talk about applying these practices to another business unit and see if it works there as well? So is that bottom up? Partly. Is it top down? No, right? It's a mix, right? It's what's going on is the team is earning progressive levels of trust at every step of the way. You can also see why this can take a while. Big organizations might have a dozen levels between a product manager and the CEO. So it takes a while for these things to happen. And just like everything else, some people in a company love the change. Some of them are much less comfortable with any kind of change. So time is important to mention there too. The other thing I wanted to mention, a couple things. I just talked about the case with this is an individual contributor. If you're a product leader, this is your job. Your job is to drive this kind of change. And I have very little sympathy for a product leader that says, I can't change anything because my CEO is not interested or our stakeholders are not interested. None of the cases is the CEO driving that. The CEO is trusting that the head of product knows how to do their job. And so it is on the product leaders to start demonstrating this trust, demonstrating these abilities. So the product leader is a very different expectation. And a big problem is when a company has a product leader that doesn't understand that this is their job. Lots of people have been talking to this lately. The best, I think, is from Shreyash Doshi. You can see what he has to say about this. And then you asked, like, what do you do if your company just doesn't want to change at all? If you've genuinely tried what we just talked about, and they're not even willing to let you do anything to improve your skills, which, by the way, is pretty rare. It's pretty rare. Then you certainly can choose to go to a different company. Just remember that anywhere you go will have challenges there too. And be very careful if you do move about who your new manager is, like we started with. That's the most important thing.
I wanted to double back to your earlier comment about convincing the head of sales. I'm trying to move our company from a very roadmappy approach to a more, product model approach. And I wanted to know how something like that is done, because they're very fixed on when will it be done? Is it this quarter or is it next quarter? That sort of thing.
By the way, this is like the normal situation in any kind of company, even if it's not sales driven. And again, if you're serious about this question, I strongly encourage you to read the book, because this is right at the center of the book. It's all those kinds of objections. That's what it's designed to answer. So I would encourage you to do that. Specifically, there is a technique that is talked about in the book for the situation you're describing, which is what I would recommend. Really two techniques. One is called an outcome-based roadmap, which is where you move your current roadmap gently towards the product model. It's sort of an intermediate stage, but it's a really good thing to do. It's safe to do. Takes a while, but it's a good thing to do. And the other technique is called a high integrity commitment, because in product companies, there are situations where you do need to provide a date, but unlike how you've been doing it, almost certainly, it needs to be a date that the company can trust, because again, everything here is built on trust. So you need to learn how to build a trustworthy, how to establish and deliver a trustworthy date. And that's called, the technique for that is called a high integrity commitment. Those are the two I would suggest you focus on, but the whole book is written to answer that question.
In the product model, there's basically three core concepts. It's about how you build, how you solve problems, and how you decide which problems to solve. If you could only choose one of these three, which one do you consider to be the most important, or which one would you prioritize?
Oh, that's a good question. Most people choose to prioritize the how you build, because that's really the foundation of everything. You can do the how you build and still be a feature team company. You would just be a better feature team company. To me, the biggest win is the changing how you decide which problems to solve. That has the biggest impact, because that is the strategy question. And I would also say, though, that the strategy one is the hardest one to do. So what a lot of companies do, fortunately, a lot of companies already have the build side under control. They're already doing things like continuous deployment. They already know how to deploy professionally. They're not doing ridiculous processes like SAFe. They're doing real product delivery. So for them, it's the choice between, do they start with product discovery or do they start with product strategy? And I recommend they start with product discovery, because even if you continue to tackle the problems that come from your stakeholders, you will do a better job achieving outcomes. And outcomes is really the bottom line, and that comes primarily from the discovery.
You mentioned that delivery is not the responsibility of product managers. Who do you think should be in charge of that?
Yeah, well, just to be very clear, the product manager is responsible for the outcomes. The product designer is responsible for the user experience, the whole experience. And the engineering tech lead is responsible for delivery. And it is true that almost every company, except for small startups, have project managers of some sort, and they usually report into engineering, because delivery is an engineering responsibility. Engineering is the day job. Delivery is the day job of your engineers. Discovery is the day job of your product managers and designers. Product managers and designers also answer questions related to delivery, and engineers answer questions related to discovery. Is really not complicated, and that's none of what I just said is new. It's in good companies, that's been the way it's been for 50 years. So it's like not any big insight. It's just that in a lot of companies, what's really going on in feature teams, the designer and the engineer role is clear, but the product manager role has never been clear in a feature team. And so they gravitate to a lot of project management, because there is project management that needs to be done. But that, if you go to a good product company, that was never the intent of the product manager. So it's just historical.
Maybe to conclude, Marty, if you had to give one advice or one recommendation, or turning that differently, if there was one thing you wish this audience would remember from this conversation, and more broadly from your last book, what would it be?
Oh, well, I mean, if you are seriously interested in transforming, and I would never force that on anybody. You should only do it if you believe it's the right thing for your company. But then I would strongly encourage you to read that book. That's why we just took the time to write it, because so many people believed it wasn't possible to transform. And it is hard to transform. That's why it's 400-page book. But it is hard, but it is very possible. And so I'm hoping you can not only read it to get the mechanics of transformation, but also the motivation for transformation so that you can see that other companies have worked their way through this, and it is possible for you to as well. So the most important takeaway, I hope, is the belief that truly transforming to work the way good companies work is possible, and that you can impact a great deal of that. All right, I hope this was useful. So thanks, everybody.